Sarah Martinez had always been good at blending in. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair usually tied back in a simple ponytail, she looked like any other woman in her late 20s. When she walked through the naval training base in her civilian clothes, most people assumed she was a contractor, maybe someone from the medical staff, or perhaps a visitor. That was exactly how she liked it. The evening air was cool as Sarah made her way across the base toward the mess hall. She had just finished a grueling 14-hour training session with her SEAL team, working on underwater demolitions in the nearby harbor. Her muscles ached, and her stomach growled loudly enough that she was sure the seagulls overhead could hear it. All she wanted was a quick meal before heading back to her quarters for some much-needed sleep. The base was quieter than usual. Most of the regular personnel had already eaten dinner and were either in their bunks or enjoying their free time in the recreation areas. Sarah preferred it this way. The fewer people around, the less chance someone would recognize her and want to chat about her recent missions or ask questions about what it was like being one of the few women in the SEALs. As she approached the mess hall, she could hear loud voices and laughter coming from inside. Through the large windows, she could see a group of young recruits sitting at one of the corner tables. They looked fresh out of high school, probably in their first few weeks of basic training. Their uniforms were still crisp and new, their haircuts so fresh you could see the pale skin where their hair used to be. Sarah paused at the entrance, considering whether to turn around and grab something from the vending machines instead. She was tired, and the last thing she wanted was to deal with rowdy recruits who might recognize her and make a scene. But her stomach growled again, reminding her that she had barely eaten anything all day except for an energy bar at dawn. She pushed through the heavy double doors and walked toward the food service area. The mess hall was mostly empty except for the group of recruits and a few other scattered personnel. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh white glow. The smell of reheated pizza and coffee filled the air. Behind the serving counter, Petty Officer Johnson was cleaning up for the night. He was a friendly older man who had been working in the mess hall for over 15 years. When he saw Sarah approaching, his face lit up with a warm smile. "Well, if it isn't our favorite ghost," he said quietly, using the nickname some of the base personnel had given Sarah because of how quietly she could move around the base. "Working late again?" "You know how it is," Sarah replied, grabbing a tray. "Any chance there's still some real food back there, or am I stuck with whatever's under those heat lamps?" Johnson glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "I saved you a plate of the good stuff: grilled chicken, real mashed potatoes, and some of those green beans you actually eat. Give me 2 minutes to heat it up properly." "You're a lifesaver, Johnson. I owe you one." While she waited, Sarah found herself glancing over at the group of recruits. There were 5 of them, all young men who looked like they had never been away from home before. They were talking loudly about their training, trying to impress each other with stories that were probably half-true at best. The one sitting with his back to her was the loudest. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident posture that suggested he had been the star athlete in his small hometown. His voice carried across the nearly empty mess hall as he told his friends about how easy the physical training had been so far. "I'm telling you guys, this stuff is nothing compared to what I was doing back home," he said, gesturing with a piece of pizza. "Coach Williams had us running 10 miles every morning before school. These drill instructors think they're tough, but they haven't seen anything yet." His friends nodded along, but Sarah could tell they were less convinced. The recruit sitting across from the loud one kept glancing around nervously, as if he was worried someone might overhear their conversation. He was smaller than the others, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he had spent more time indoors than on football fields. "I don't know, Marcus," the nervous recruit said quietly. "Some of the older guys were telling me that the real training hasn't even started yet. They said we're still in the easy part." Marcus laughed and took another bite of his pizza. "Come on, Derek. Don't tell me you're already getting scared. We haven't even been here 2 weeks. Sarah tried to ignore their conversation and focus on waiting for her food, but something about Marcus's tone was starting to irritate her. She had seen plenty of recruits like him over the years. They came in thinking they were hot stuff because they had been successful in high school sports or had watched too many action movies. Most of them either learned humility quickly or washed out of training within a few months. Johnson returned with her plate, and the smell of properly seasoned food made her stomach growl again. "Here you go. Eat up before it gets cold." Sarah thanked him and looked around for a quiet place to sit. The mess hall had plenty of empty tables, but she noticed that the recruits' table was positioned in a way that made it difficult to get to most of the seating area without walking past them. She chose a table near the far wall, hoping to eat in peace. As she sat down and took her first bite of chicken, she heard Marcus's voice getting even louder. Now he was talking about women in the military, and his opinions were making Sarah's jaw clench involuntarily. "I mean, I'm not saying women can't serve," Marcus was saying, "but let's be realistic about what they can and can't do. There's a reason you don't see any female SEALs or Rangers. Some jobs just require a certain level of physical capability." Derek looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Actually, I think I read somewhere that there are women in special forces now. Maybe not a lot, but some." Marcus shook his head confidently. "Trust me, man. I've done my research. The standards are different for women. They lower the bar so they can say they're being inclusive. But when it comes to the real deal, the dangerous missions, it's still all men doing the heavy lifting." Sarah set down her fork and took a slow, deep breath. She had heard these arguments countless times before, usually from men who had never even made it through basic SEAL training themselves. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was sitting less than 50 feet away from someone who was confidently explaining why she couldn't do the job she had been doing successfully for the past 6 years. She tried to focus on her food. But Marcus wasn't finished. He was now telling his friends about a YouTube video he had watched about military training, as if watching videos made him an expert on special operations. The more he talked, the more animated he became, and his voice kept getting louder. "The thing is, when you're in a real combat situation, you need to know that the person next to you can handle themselves," Marcus continued. "You can't be worrying about whether they're strong enough to carry you out if you get hit, or fast enough to keep up during a firefight. It's life and death stuff." One of the other recruits, a quiet young man with red hair, finally spoke up. "But what if they can meet the same standards as the men? I mean, if they can do everything required, what's the problem?" Marcus laughed as if the question was ridiculous. "Come on, Tommy. Be realistic. How many women do you know who can do 50 pull-ups or carry a 150-pound pack for 20 miles? It's just biology, man. Nothing personal against women, but facts are facts." Sarah had to resist the urge to walk over and demonstrate exactly how many pull-ups she could do. Instead, she continued eating and tried to think about something else. She was used to dealing with ignorant comments, and engaging with every person who had uninformed opinions would be a full-time job. But Marcus was just getting started. Now he was talking about what he would do if he ever encountered a female soldier in a combat zone, as if he was already planning his hypothetical military career. His friends were mostly listening politely, but Sarah could tell they were getting uncomfortable with his increasingly loud and opinionated monologue. The mess hall was getting quieter as the few other people finished their meals and left. Soon, it was just Sarah, the 5 recruits, and Johnson, who was making as much noise as possible while cleaning in the hopes that the recruits would take the hint and leave. Sarah finished her meal and was getting ready to bus her tray when she heard Marcus say something that made her stop in her tracks. "The bottom line is, if I ever found myself in a situation where some woman was trying to tell me what to do in a military setting, I'd have to set her straight. Not in a mean way, but she'd need to understand the natural order of things. Some jobs are just meant for men." Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Marcus, maybe you should keep your voice down. You never know who might be listening." "Why? It's not like I'm saying anything controversial. I'm just being honest about reality." Sarah stood up slowly, her tray in her hands. She had reached her limit for the evening. All she wanted to do was clear her dishes and head back to her quarters without any drama. But as she walked toward the dish return area, she had to pass relatively close to the recruit's table. As she walked by, Marcus's voice seemed to get even louder, as if he was performing for her benefit. "I mean, look around. Do you see any women here who look like they could handle real military action? Most of them probably can't even do basic push-ups. Sarah paused near their table, not quite sure why. She should have just kept walking, returned her tray, and left. But something about the combination of exhaustion, hunger that was only partially satisfied, and pure frustration made her stop. Marcus had his back to her and was still talking to his friends, apparently unaware that she was standing just a few feet away. His friends, however, had noticed her presence, and their expressions were starting to change from polite attention to nervous concern. Seriously, Marcus continued. If I ever met a woman who claimed she was in the SEALs or something crazy like that, I'd probably just laugh. Can you imagine? A woman thinking she could hang with the most elite warriors in the world? Derek was now staring directly at Sarah with wide eyes, clearly trying to signal to Marcus that he should stop talking. But Marcus was too caught up in his own voice to notice. Sarah shifted her weight slightly, causing the floor to creak just enough that Marcus finally realized someone was behind him. He turned around casually, expecting to see Johnson, or maybe another recruit. Instead, he found himself looking up at a woman who was standing very still and very quiet, holding a food tray, with an expression on her face that he couldn't quite read. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Oh, hey," Marcus said, flashing what he probably thought was a charming smile. "Sorry, didn't realize you were there. We weren't talking about anything important." Sarah looked down at him for a long moment, then glanced at his friends, who were all staring at her with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. She could walk away right now, she told herself. She could just nod politely, return her tray, and leave. No one would ever know that they had been talking about her without realizing it. But then Marcus opened his mouth again. "Actually, since you're here, maybe you can settle a debate we were having. My friends think I'm being too harsh. But I was just explaining how women aren't really cut out for the tougher military jobs. Not saying anything bad about women, just being realistic. You probably understand what I mean, right?" The mess hall had become completely silent, except for the hum of the refrigerators and the distant sound of Johnson washing dishes. Sarah looked at Marcus for another long moment, then at his friends, who were all holding their breath. She set her tray down on an empty chair and pulled out the chair across from Marcus. As she sat down, she noticed that Derek had gone completely pale, and Tommy was staring at her as if he had seen a ghost. "Actually," Sarah said quietly, "I think there might be a few things about women in the military that you haven't considered." Marcus leaned back in his chair with a confident grin, clearly pleased that the woman had decided to join their conversation. He had no idea that he was about to step into the deepest hole he had ever dug for himself. "See? I knew you'd get it," Marcus said, gesturing towards Sarah, as if she had already agreed with him. "You work here on base, right? So you've seen how things really work. You know, I'm not trying to be mean or anything, just realistic about what different people are capable of." Sarah folded her hands on the table and looked directly at Marcus. Her expression was calm, almost friendly. But there was something in her eyes that made Derek sink lower in his chair. "What's your name?" "Recruit." "Marcus Webb," he answered, puffing his chest out slightly. "I'm from Oklahoma. Been here about 10 days now. But I'm already near the top of my training class in most areas." "That's impressive, Marcus from Oklahoma," Sarah said evenly. 10 whole days. You must have learned a lot about military operations in that time." Marcus missed the subtle sarcasm entirely. "Well, I've been preparing for this my whole life. Played football, did wrestling, studied military history. I probably know more about special operations than most people twice my age." Tommy, the redhead, was now staring at Sarah with a growing look of recognition, as if something about her was starting to seem familiar. But Marcus was too focused on his own voice to notice his friend's expression. "So tell me about these things I haven't considered," Marcus continued. "I'm always open to learning, but I've done a lot of research on this topic." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Research. That's good. Where did most of your research come from? Books, documentaries, online articles?" "I've watched every military movie ever made, read everything I could get my hands on about the SEALs, Delta Force, all the elite units. I know the history, the The training requirements, the physical standards. Movies, Sarah repeated. Interesting research method. Derek was trying to catch Marcus's attention by clearing his throat loudly. But Marcus was completely focused on what he clearly thought was going to be an easy debate with someone who would ultimately agree with his worldview. Exactly. And none of those movies show women in combat roles for a reason. They want to be accurate to what really happens. Sarah smiled slightly, and somehow that small smile made the temperature in the room seem to drop a few degrees. Marcus, can I ask you something? In all your research about the SEALs, did you happen to learn anything about their selection process? Of course, Marcus replied confidently. It's the toughest military training in the world. Hell Week, underwater demolition, survival training, psychological evaluation. Only about 20% of candidates make it through. 20%, Sarah repeated. That's a pretty high failure rate. What do you think separates the 20% who make it from the 80% who don't? Marcus shrugged. Physical capability, mental toughness, refusing to give up. The stuff that comes naturally to certain types of people. Certain types of people, Sarah said slowly. Like you? Well, I'm confident I could handle it. I've been training my whole life for something like this. Tommy was now tugging on Marcus's sleeve, trying to get his attention, but Marcus brushed him off without looking away from Sarah. That's fascinating, Sarah continued. So, you believe that physical capability is the most important factor in special operations success? Absolutely. If you can't carry your gear, keep up with the team, and physically dominate the enemy, nothing else matters. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What about intelligence gathering? Language skills? Cultural awareness? The ability to blend in with local populations? Marcus waved dismissively. Sure, that stuff is important too, but it's secondary. The foundation is physical capability. Everything else is just extras. Extras, Sarah repeated. So if someone could, say, speak 4 languages fluently, had extensive knowledge of explosives and demolition techniques, and could navigate by stars alone, but they were a woman, you'd still consider them less valuable than a man who was just physically strong? I'm not saying less valuable as a person, Marcus said, clearly thinking he was being generous. Just less suitable for elite military roles. It's about putting the right people in the right positions. Derek had given up trying to get Marcus's attention and was now just staring at the table, apparently hoping it would swallow him up. The other 3 recruits were looking increasingly uncomfortable, but Marcus was still completely oblivious to the tension he was creating. That makes sense from your perspective, Sarah said. Tell me, Marcus from Oklahoma, what specific experience do you have with combat situations? Marcus straightened up. Well, I haven't been deployed yet, obviously, since I just started training. But I've been in plenty of fights, and I've never backed down from anyone. Plus, I've studied tactics extensively. Fights, Sarah nodded. High school fights? Some in high school, some after. I'm just saying I know how to handle myself when things get physical. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking at Marcus as if she was trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, she spoke again. Marcus, I want to tell you a story. Last month, I was part of a mission in a country I can't name, working with local forces to extract a captured intelligence officer. The mission required infiltrating a heavily guarded compound without being detected. Marcus leaned forward, interested despite himself. What kind of compound? The kind where being caught meant torture and execution for everyone involved. The plan required someone to get close to the guards, gain their trust, and create a distraction while the rest of the team moved into position. Sounds like a job for someone with serious combat skills, Marcus said. It was. But the guards were all men who came from a very traditional culture. They would never have trusted a male stranger enough to let him get close. So the team member who volunteered for the job had to be someone who could appear harmless and non-threatening, someone the guards would underestimate. Marcus was starting to look slightly less confident. Okay, so what happened? The team member approached the guards pretending to be a lost civilian. While they were deciding what to do with this apparently helpless person, she identified the locations of all 7 guards, memorized their weapons and equipment, and counted the seconds it would take to neutralize each one if necessary. She? Marcus said, his voice slightly higher than before. When the distraction signal came, she disabled 4 guards in under 6 seconds using hand-to-hand combat techniques, while the rest of the team took out the remaining 3 from distance. The mission was completed without a single friendly casualty. The mess hall was now completely silent. Johnson had stopped washing dishes and was listening intently, though he was trying to pretend he wasn't paying attention. Marcus swallowed hard. That's a great story, but I'm not sure what your point is. You're probably just repeating something you heard from someone else. Sarah smiled again, and this time there was something almost predatory about it. You think I'm repeating a story I heard? Well, yeah. I mean, no offense, but you work in a mess hall or something, right? You're not exactly a special operations expert. Tommy suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm. Marcus, shut up. Please just shut up right now. But Marcus was too deep into his own assumptions to listen. Look, I'm not trying to be rude, but let's be honest about who we're dealing with here. You seem nice, but you're obviously not military personnel, and you definitely don't have any real combat experience. Sarah stood up slowly, and something about the way she moved made all 5 recruits freeze in their chairs. Her movements were fluid and controlled, like a predator that had decided it was time to stop playing with its prey. Marcus from Oklahoma, she said quietly. I want you to look at me very carefully and tell me what you see. Marcus looked up at her, and for the first time, he seemed to notice details he had missed before. The way she stood with perfect balance. The scars on her hands that were visible when she moved. The fact that despite being relatively small, she somehow seemed to take up more space in the room than anyone else. I see a woman who works on a military base, Marcus said, but his voice had lost most of its confidence. Look harder. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see the exact second when several pieces of information clicked into place in his brain. His face went from confused to concerned to absolutely terrified in the space of about 3 heartbeats. Oh no, Derek whispered. You're starting to get it, Sarah said. But let me make it perfectly clear for you. My name is Sarah Martinez. I hold the rank of Petty Officer First Class in the United States Navy. For the past 6 years, I have been a member of SEAL Team 3, which means I have successfully completed every single training program you've been fantasizing about attempting. Marcus's mouth fell open, but no words came out. I have participated in 47 combat missions across 4 different continents. I speak fluent Arabic, Farsi, Spanish, and enough Mandarin to get by in a pinch. I am qualified as an expert marksman with 7 different weapon systems. Certified in underwater demolition, high-altitude parachuting, and close-quarters combat. The recruit who had been sitting quietly throughout the conversation was now staring at Sarah with undisguised awe. You're her. You're the one they call Ghost. Sarah glanced at him with mild surprise. You've heard that nickname? My brother graduated from here 3 years ago. He said there was a female SEAL who could appear and disappear like smoke, and that she once took down 6 enemy combatants with just a knife and a piece of rope. It was 7 combatants, Sarah corrected. And I used the rope to tie them up afterward. Not as a weapon, though it would have worked as a weapon if necessary. Marcus was now the color of old newspaper. I didn't know. I mean, you thought a lot of things, Marcus from Oklahoma. You thought you knew who could and couldn't do certain jobs based on what you've seen in movies. You thought you could identify a person's capabilities by looking at them. You thought your 10 days of basic training gave you the authority to speak as an expert on military operations. Sarah sat back down and leaned across the table toward Marcus, who pressed himself back in his chair as if he could somehow disappear. But here's what you didn't think about, recruit. You didn't think about the fact that the woman sitting behind you might have more combat experience than every action movie star you've ever watched combined. You didn't think about the possibility that someone might have been listening who could actually demonstrate exactly how wrong your assumptions were. I'm sorry, Marcus whispered. I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You had already decided what reality looked like. And you weren't interested in information that contradicted your preconceptions. Derek finally found his voice. Ma'am, we're really sorry about this. We tried to tell him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. Sarah looked around the table at the other 4 recruits. The rest of you seem to understand that your friend stepped in something he shouldn't have. That shows better judgment than he's displayed tonight. Tommy raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Is it true what they say about SEAL training? About how it's designed to break people mentally as much as physically? Sarah nodded. Every part of the training is designed to test your limits and then push you past them. The physical requirements are just the beginning. The real test is whether you can think clearly and make good decisions when you're exhausted, stressed, and operating on pure willpower. And you got through all of that? Asked the quiet recruit who had recognized her. I got through it the same way every SEAL gets through it. One day at a time, one challenge at a time. By refusing to quit when everything in my body and mind was telling me to give up. Marcus finally managed to speak again. Ma'am, I made a huge mistake tonight. I said things that were ignorant and disrespectful, and I realize now how wrong I was. Sarah studied his face for a moment. The question is, Marcus from Oklahoma, what are you going to do with this realization? I don't understand. You have 2 choices. You can decide that this was an embarrassing incident that you want to forget as quickly as possible. Learn nothing from it, and continue making assumptions about people based on your limited experience. Or you can use this as an opportunity to understand that the world is more complex than your preconceptions, and that true strength comes from being willing to listen, learn, and admit when you're wrong. Marcus nodded earnestly. I want to learn. I really do. I feel like an idiot for everything I said tonight. Feeling like an idiot is a good start, but the real test will be how you behave going forward. Especially when you think no one is watching who might call you out on your assumptions. The mess hall had become so quiet that they could hear the wind blowing outside. Johnson had finished cleaning and was clearly waiting for everyone to leave so he could lock up, but he seemed reluctant to interrupt what was obviously an important conversation. Sarah stood up again. Gentlemen, it's getting late, and I'm sure you have early training tomorrow. But before I go, I want to leave you with something to think about. Sarah looked at each of the 5 young men sitting around the table, taking a moment to really see them as individuals, rather than just a group of recruits who had gotten in over their heads. The most dangerous enemy a soldier can face isn't the one shooting at you from across a battlefield, she said quietly. It's the assumptions in your own head that prevent you from seeing the situation clearly. Every person you meet in your military career will have capabilities, experiences, and knowledge that might surprise you. Your job is to stay curious and humble enough to learn from them. Derek nodded seriously. Yes, ma'am. We understand. Do you? Because it's easy to nod and agree when you're sitting here feeling embarrassed. The real test will come later. When you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations, and you have to choose between sticking with your assumptions or staying open to new information. Marcus was still staring at the table, apparently trying to process everything that had happened in the last few minutes. Ma'am, can I ask you something else? What is it, Marcus? When you were going through SEAL training, did other people ever make assumptions about you like I did tonight? Sarah smiled slightly, and for the first time that evening, it was a genuinely warm smile. Every single day. Marcus. Some people assumed I couldn't do the job before I even tried. Others assumed I was only there to make a political statement. Some thought the standards must have been lowered just for me. And yes, some people said almost exactly the same things you said tonight. How did you deal with it? At first, I tried to argue with everyone who had doubts about my capabilities. I thought if I could just explain myself well enough, or prove myself completely enough, everyone would eventually understand and accept me. Tommy leaned forward. Did it work? Not even a little bit. I learned that you can't argue someone out of a belief they didn't logic themselves into. People who want to doubt you will find reasons to doubt you, no matter what you accomplish. But people who are genuinely open to being wrong will figure it out on their own when they're ready. So what did you do instead? I focused on doing my job better than anyone could argue with, and I stopped caring about convincing people who weren't interested in being convinced. The people whose opinions actually mattered were the ones working alongside me, depending on me, and seeing what I could do when it counted. Marcus looked up from the table. Were you ever scared? During training or missions? Sarah considered the question carefully. Marcus, anyone who tells you they've never been scared in combat is either lying or dangerously stupid. Fear is information. It tells you when a situation is serious, and you need to be extra careful and focused. The trick is learning to use fear as fuel instead of letting it control you. But how do you learn that? Practice. Lots and lots of practice in controlled situations until your training becomes automatic. When your body knows what to do without your brain having to think about it, you can think clearly, even when you're terrified. The quiet recruit who had been mostly listening raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, what was the scariest moment you've ever had? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. 2 years ago, my team was providing support for a rescue operation in hostile territory. We were supposed to be backup, staying in a secure position while another unit went in to extract some captured civilians. The recruits were hanging on every word. The primary team ran into unexpected resistance and took casualties. We found ourselves in a situation where we had to choose between following our original orders to stay put or disobeying direct orders to help people who were going to die if we didn't act. What did you do? We went in. All of us knew we could face court-martial for disobeying orders, but we couldn't live with ourselves if we followed protocol and watched good people die when we had the training and equipment to help them. Derek's eyes were wide. What happened? We got everyone out alive, including the wounded from the primary team. But the scariest moment wasn't the firefight or the explosions or any of the obvious dangers. What was it? It was the 30 seconds right after we made the decision to disobey orders, when I realized that everything that happened next would be my responsibility. Not just my own life, but the lives of my team members and the people we were trying to save. In that moment, I understood that being a SEAL isn't about being fearless or physically superior. It's about being willing to carry responsibility that would crush most people. The mess hall was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Even Johnson had stopped pretending to work and was openly listening to Sarah's story. Marcus spoke very quietly. Did you get in trouble for disobeying orders? We were investigated for 3 months. Eventually, we were cleared of any wrongdoing because the situation had changed enough that our orders no longer applied. But for those 3 months, we didn't know if our careers were over. Do you regret it? Not for a second. But it taught me that real courage isn't about being willing to fight. It's about being willing to make difficult decisions and live with the consequences, even when you can't predict what those consequences might be. Tommy shook his head in amazement. I can't imagine having that kind of responsibility. A year ago, you probably couldn't imagine doing 50 push-ups or marching 20 miles with a heavy pack either. But here you are. People are capable of growing into responsibilities that seem impossible when they're starting out. Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave, but Marcus spoke up again. Ma'am, I know I don't have any right to ask this after everything I said tonight, but could you give us some advice? About training, I mean, about how to get through it without washing out. Sarah paused and looked at the 5 young men. They were all staring at her with expressions of genuine respect and curiosity, so different from the overconfident assumptions Marcus had displayed at the beginning of the evening. The most important thing to understand is that everyone who makes it through training has moments where they want to quit. Everyone. The difference between the people who make it and the people who don't isn't that some people never want to give up. It's that some people want something more than they want to quit. What do you mean? You need to figure out your why. Why are you here? What are you hoping to accomplish? Who are you trying to serve? If your why is just about proving you're tough, or getting respect, or having exciting stories to tell, it probably won't be strong enough to carry you through the hardest moments. Derek leaned forward. What was your why? I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. I wanted to develop capabilities that could help protect people who couldn't protect themselves. And I wanted to prove to myself that I could rise to meet any challenge if I was willing to work hard enough. Did it work? I mean, Did you find what you were looking for? Sarah smiled. I found things I didn't even know I was looking for. I found out that I'm stronger than I thought possible. But also that strength comes in forms I never expected. I learned that the best teams aren't made up of people who never disagree, but people who trust each other enough to disagree honestly and work through their differences. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Ma'am, I want to apologize again for everything I said earlier. Not just because you turned out to be someone who could prove me wrong, but because I was being disrespectful to women in general. And that's not the kind of person I want to be. The fact that you can recognize that shows growth, Marcus. The question is whether you'll remember this feeling tomorrow, next week, and next year when you're in situations where it might be easier to fall back into old assumptions. I'll remember. I promise I'll remember. Sarah stood up and picked up her tray. I hope you do. All of you have the potential to become excellent service members if you're willing to stay humble and keep learning. But that choice has to be made new every day. As she started to walk away, Tommy called after her. Ma'am? Will we see you around the base again? Sarah turned back with a slight smile. I'm sure you will. But next time, you might not recognize me. That's kind of the point of my job. Derek laughed nervously. How are we supposed to know if we're being respectful to everyone if we can't tell who they are? That's the beauty of it, Derek. If you're respectful to everyone, it doesn't matter who they turn out to be. Sarah walked over to the dish return area where Johnson was waiting with a knowing smile on his face. Eventful dinner? He asked quietly. Educational, Sarah replied, setting down her tray. For everyone involved. Those boys are going to be talking about this for months. Hopefully they'll be thinking about it too. Sometimes the best lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments. Johnson nodded toward the table where the 5 recruits were still sitting in stunned silence. Think they learned something? Sarah glanced back at them. Marcus was talking quietly to his friends, gesturing as he spoke, and from his body language, it looked like he was trying to process everything that had happened. The other 4 were listening intently, occasionally asking questions or offering comments. I think they learned that their assumptions might not always be accurate, Sarah said. Whether they hold on to that lesson or forget it when it becomes inconvenient remains to be seen. Well, for what it's worth, I think you handled that perfectly. You could have embarrassed that kid a lot worse than you did. Sarah considered this. Embarrassing him wasn't the goal. The goal was helping him understand that the world is more complex than he realized. Hopefully, next time he encounters someone who doesn't match his expectations, he'll be curious instead of dismissive. And if he's not, then he'll wash out of training soon enough anyway. The military has a way of teaching humility to people who are willing to learn it, and weeding out people who aren't. Sarah said goodbye to Johnson and walked toward the exit. As she passed the recruits' table, she heard Marcus saying something that made her pause. Guys, I feel like such an idiot. Here I was talking about how women can't handle military service, and I was sitting 3 feet away from someone who's probably tougher than all of us combined. The crazy thing is, Tommy replied, she could have shut you down at any point, but she let you keep talking until you dug yourself into the deepest hole possible. Derek laughed. I was trying to get you to stop, man. I could tell something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. What tipped you off? Marcus asked. The way she moved, the way she sat, the way she listened to everything we said without seeming threatened or impressed by any of it, and her hands. Man, did you see the scars on her hands? Those weren't from working in an office. Marcus shook his head. I wasn't paying attention to any of that stuff. I was too busy hearing myself talk. That's the lesson, though, right? Said the quiet recruit. Pay attention to what's actually in front of you, instead of just assuming you already know what you're looking at. Sarah smiled to herself and continued walking toward the door. Maybe they had learned something after all. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Sarah reflected on the encounter. She had come to the mess hall looking for nothing more complicated than a quiet meal and some rest. Instead, she had ended up in an impromptu teaching moment with 5 recruits who needed to learn some hard truths about assumptions and respect. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The military was slowly changing, becoming more inclusive and diverse. But change was never easy or fast. There would always be people like Marcus, who meant well but carried assumptions that limited their understanding of the world around them. But there would also be people like Derek and Tommy, who were smart enough to recognize when their friend was making mistakes and humble enough to learn from uncomfortable situations. And occasionally, there would be people willing to listen when someone took the time to share hard-won wisdom. Sarah walked across the base toward her quarters, thinking about the mission she had told the recruits about. She hadn't mentioned that the intelligence officer they had rescued was also a woman, or that the local forces they had worked with included several female soldiers who had proven themselves in combat repeatedly. Some stories were better saved for another day. When the audience was ready to hear them, as she reached her building, Sarah looked back toward the mess hall, where she could see the 5 recruits still sitting around their table, talking intensely. Whatever they were discussing, it looked serious and thoughtful, which was probably a good sign. Tomorrow, they would wake up and continue their training. They would face new challenges, learn new skills, and hopefully develop into the kind of service members who could handle responsibility with wisdom and humility. Some of them would make it through training, and some wouldn't. But at least now, they had one more piece of information to help them navigate the complex realities of military service. And Marcus from Oklahoma would never again assume that someone's capabilities could be determined by their appearance, at least not without remembering the night he learned otherwise from a woman who could have taught him that lesson in much less comfortable ways. Sarah climbed the stairs to her quarters, already thinking about tomorrow's training schedule. There was always more work to do, more skills to develop, more challenges to meet, but tonight, she was satisfied with the knowledge that she had taken a few minutes to help some young soldiers understand that strength, courage, and capability came in more forms than they had previously imagined. Sometimes, the most important missions happened in the most unexpected places.